Hello, folks. Hello. Welcome back to another episode. I mean, I got to say, I've been, on my end, I've been delivering. I've been getting some people on. That's my job. I get the people on. I reach out. Most of the time, they say yes. I feel pretty excited. You guys have had some pretty good episodes. I mean, I'm talking Johnny Iron, Dr. Michael Bennett. We've had Robert Worley from Camp of the Unknown God. And then now we got Basil Rosewater and his host, I'm sorry, I almost missed it right here. Oh, this is bad. Oh, Christopher Ryan Gates, I got you. But hey, I'm going to give you guys a proper introduction. So, if you don't know who Basil Rosewater is, you might know him from Canary Cry Radio, Canary Cry News Talk, Joyspiracy Theory, or as he's known as a new show, The Man-Child, which is hilarious. And then Christopher Ryan Gates. He has a PhD in biblical interpretation, adjunct professor of biblical studies and theology, specializes in hermeneutics and gospel studies. What's going on, guys? Welcome to Fire Theft Radio.
How's it going, buddy?
Hello. Hello. And hey, so thank you so much for making some time. I know, Basil, you're busy, and you being a doc and all, I'm sure you're busy as well. You know what I'm saying? And so thank you for coming on, man.
Yeah, appreciate it. You caught us at a good time because, since the pandemic started, I started doing Canary Cry News Talk 3 times a week, and we do like 3 or 4 hours a day when we do that, plus post and pre-production, and it's looking.
That thing is a monster.
Yeah, it's a little bit too close to like a real job than I ever expected podcasting would be.
Right.
But we have this week off, so I get my first official vacation since the pandemic started. So yeah, I got all the time in the world, man. And of course, what do I do with my vacation? I just do more podcasts.
There you go. I mean, that's what podcasters would do, you know, so I appreciate you. And on your time off, you know, that's even more valuable to me. So thank you for that. You know what I mean?
Well, I had to do it. I was glad that you reached out, man. It's been a while since we've talked last.
Yes, indeed. I think the last time we spoke was on your show, the Joyspiracy Theory, and lots been going on since. Man, I think when I was talking to you then, I was trying to get my black belt. I achieved it, got it. So I'm full-on black belt Shotokan karate now, man.
Whoa, watch out, street criminals.
Yes, indeed. Yes, and
vigilante. What's gonna be your vigilante? Street vigilante name?
Well, because I'm a little heavy set, people have dubbed me Kung Fu Panda, which I kind of.
That's good though. That's a good one.
I was like, yeah, I'll take it. He's pretty dope. You know what I mean?
Well, I was looking at myself in the mirror the other day, and I thought I looked like a panda too, mainly because I haven't been sleeping well, and I have big dark circles right now. Ooh. And so I was like, I kind of look like a panda. I could just embrace this. But no Kung Fu.
Yeah, no Kung Fu, man. It's all good.
Well, cool, man. Just as a quick comment, something interesting about that podcast, the Joyspiracy Theory, that I had both of you guys on, actually, and Chris had an episode too. Wow, this is fun. I'm surrounded by former guests of my podcast. Those episodes of Joyspiracy Theory, they do a great job, I think, of capturing a moment in people's lives. Like we do testimonies and we talk about life history and stuff, but we also talk about like where people's lives are at that exact moment. Mm-hmm. And I've had a couple people reach out. Actually, a couple of them were like kind of felt weird about having the podcast up because they're just in a different place in life. And I'm like, that is sort of just how time works. I totally understand that. But it's kind of fun talking to people later on and like seeing how things are new, how has life changed. Mm-hmm. Some people share some like problems, some current problems in their life on the podcast, and then to kind of hear how those problems resolved has been very interesting. Mm-hmm. I might have to do like a Joyspiracy Theory follow-up series on so everybody gets an updated version.
It's like it's like therapy for us guests on your show. You know what I mean?
It's therapy for me too.
Yeah,
I get to forget about my own problems for a second.
Oh gosh. Well, I wanted you guys on because I mean, that is true. It's funny because not only that, like I mentioned that, I think I was mentioning my dating life, and now I'm engaged and soon to be married, and
Yeah, that's
so
exciting,
yeah,
man.
it's pretty exciting. A lot of stuff happening, and I'm just kind of like, all right, let's move forward. Let's do this, and I'm personally surprised, like because when me and Omar set out to do the show, unfortunately he couldn't be here today, but when we set out to do the show, I mean, we kind of had this idea of like tackling, all the weird stuff, and we got our inspiration. I'm sure we've told you before, we got our inspiration from shows like your Canary Cry and things like that, and different shows that we used to listen to, and we were like, all right, we should do something like that and kind of approach it differently. But we honestly, like along the way, we started realizing the show itself has changed a lot, and it's kind of a mixed bag of different kinds of episodes. And some of the episodes are like the ones we're going to do today, which is really getting into like the Bible, getting into biblical studies and how we should be approaching the Bible, because me and Omar love the weird, that we can talk about all that stuff all the time, and the fringy things of the world, the things that are considered conspiracy and whatnot. But our biggest struggle during that time when we got fully immersed in those things was like our emotional state kind of was just so much different. It was just like really. There's a lot of noise in the background. Sorry, guys. We got gardeners, of course, coming right now to do the thing. But
that's how it happens.
That's how it goes. And so we realized we were just kind of in a dark place, kind of in a rut, because I don't know, if you look into a lot of the things that we discuss on our show and shows like on Canary Cry, things can get pretty doom and gloom, And so really what pulled us out of that is like really starting to study the Bible a lot more, and then pretty much just kind of undoing all the things that we thought we knew about it, and it started helping us emotionally, and that's why we bumped into, of course, Mike Davis, and Mike is huge on pulling the things that the Bible talks about when it comes to how we deal with emotions, and which I didn't know was in there, and that's part of not understanding the Bible correctly because we just read it according to how we were brought up or whatever it was, and so your new show, which is Ravel Podcast. I'd like to kind of talk about that a little bit, because we want to kind of set this up to first understand what your show is about, your new show, and as well, we're going to give you examples of what we're going to do with understanding the Bible today in this episode, because I think knowing all this other stuff, we like to say over and over on the show, you can have tea with a Mad Hatter for way too long, and then you go a little crazy yourself. You forget, almost about other things. And so you want to not stay there in Wonderland so much and really just ground yourself. And if you're going to go into these things, I strongly see now and strongly recommend, I meant to say, that having a strong biblical foundation is going to help you substantially, because if not, you're going to also encounter very weird kind of denominational things, the new weird fringe stuff like Paul. We shouldn't be listening to Paul, like the Trinity isn't a thing, like these other verses taken out of context. And so it just kind of follows along with it. Not to mention that there's a whole genre of people that are quote unquote red pilled, but also include Christianity as part of the problem, right? Because this was man made. It's not and they quote a lot of verses that are just completely out of context as well. Which is why I was like, you know what, we got to get you guys on. When I listened to that episode, Prolegomena, did I say that right, Chris?
Yeah,
you got it.
Oh,
very
sweet.
Nice.
I had to practice with him, like when I talked to him like a few days ago, in order to say that word. When I listened to that episode, it really was like, dude, that's why we do some of our episodes. Because if you go through our episodes, some of them are like about, reptilian overlords and whatever, and some of them are absolutely just 100% Bible study. Like we'll have Heiser on, and we'll have Mike Davis on, our resident scholar, and different things like that, just so that people can say, okay, we need some really good context foundationally so we can move forward. And sorry for maybe I just was a little redundant there, but I just wanted to really set the stage for this episode,
No, and it makes a lot of sense. And I'll kind of start, Chris, and then I'll pass it on
take it
to
away.
you. But just to take a couple steps back, what you were mentioning, you can focus so much on the weird stuff and become a little bit unmoored. And that's something I've noticed just sort of over the past 10 years that I've been podcasting. And that's why I started the Joyspiracy Theory, in 2015. Again, that plays a huge role in why Ravel started. And I want to first say, here's the thing, folks. There's a whole story. You'll hear about it on the podcast. There are 2 Ravel podcasts.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not going to get into the whole thing. I'm not going to take the war to multiple fronts. I'll spare Fire Theft Radio the brunt of it. But we had registered Ravel as a podcast on the app, on all the podcast servers, on all the URLs. And admittedly, we didn't start putting out episodes right away. This is in 2018. But in 2020, some other podcasters thought they would get froggy and take the podcast name Ravel. So there's actually 2 Ravel podcasts. Ours is the original one, the OG. And there's a couple ways to find it. But the main thing is if you search Ravel with no capitalized R, that's the best way to do it. And when you're looking through, it's the one with the cool logo, not the lame one. It's got a white background. You'll know it.
Yeah, it looks like when you get those what are they called? Those little things that you can make a ton of circles with, and it makes different designs every time.
Oh yeah, those spirograph. That's right.
Yeah, yours looks like a spirograph, and theirs looks like a 3-year-old child was trying to color something.
Oh my goodness, guys, come on!
We didn't say it. It's not us.
Hey, I'll take the brunt of that. It's me. This is me.
Clean, man.
Yeah.
Oh man. I can't.
I'm just stating facts. We had the name first. They took the name.
We did.
And I'm not encouraging. In fact,
is this considered cyberbullying? I don't know.
I do explicitly ask, don't cyberbully the other Ravel. Don't leave mean comments or anything.
I did notice after we first launched, I was checking, and there were some. We got nasty comments on both sides. We received a bad review, and they received a bad review. And I was like, hey, listen, everybody, come on, let's all
everybody. We are not condoning cyberbullying the other Ravel. We're gonna let the work speak for itself and let the best Ravel stand or be left standing. But that's all besides the point. That's just so people can find it. We're the ones with the white background and the cool logo, not the bad one. Okay. But you also, if you listen to them, you'll notice the difference right away because they are like a round table. It's just totally different. They're a little bit more on the sort of like progressive deconstructionist type of side, and we're not, obviously.
Right.
So you should notice in the first few minutes if you're listening to the correct one or not.
And additionally, we do have our names on the cover there, so you can just make sure you find the names in the fine print at the bottom too. But
so in 2018, I was feeling very strongly that exactly what you're talking about. Like I've done the kind of like fringy, weird stuff. At that time, I had been doing Canary Cry News Talk, so I had sort of a news analysis and deconstruction style show. Had been doing the Joyspiracy Theory, which originally was to have an opportunity to connect to other people and talk about stuff that isn't, like you said, lizard people and, just Nazis in Antarctica or something. But really felt the calling that it was time to really focus on the Bible and focus on Christianity. In 2018, that we were right in the midst of sort of the mass progressive Christian deconstructionist movements. People were, I think, maybe correctly is not the word, but that there were people who were really unhappy with the way the American church had been going. And so there was a lot of criticism and I would say legit theological exploration that was unorthodox and was sort of pointed towards, how can we recreate the church or destroy the church or change the church or whatever. So it was right during this time. And that's really when I personally was feeling, oh man, this is kind of a conversation that I want to get into. I want to I want to explore the Bible. I want to, this is kind of, I don't know, speak into what's happening in the world, because I think a lot of Christians were sort of disconnected from what was happening in the church and the criticisms it was receiving from the inside. And it was all just very interesting. And that's when Chris, we kind of he did a podcast episode with me. I got to hear his life story, and at the time he was working on his PhD. So he was not yet a full doctor. He was just a little baby doctor. He was still a little goo goo gaga doctor. But now he's the real deal. And we kind of just both, I forget, how did this happen? We just kind of talked, we vibed on the episode, and then what, did I ask you to do a podcast? Did you ask me? How did we get there, Chris? I'm not even remembering.
Well,
how did we get here?
As I remember it,
I'm asking myself this question all the time.
Record goes off. Yeah. Record goes off. We talked for another, I don't know, hour or two or something about, I don't remember what, but some stuff. And then you said I could keep your contact information, whatever. So I did. And then I had been, the reason I even called and kind of wanted to be on the show, you were asking for guests. And I was thinking to myself, I think I might like to do a podcast, and I'm getting this skill set where I might actually have something worth saying that people might want to listen to. So it had been in my mind to kind of do that, and to have kind of a podcast where I would talk, kind of do like a Bible study kind of podcast, and just be able to share all of these fascinating things I'm learning with whoever wants to listen, So I had reached back out to you sometime, I don't know, a few weeks, month or so, maybe after I had been on the show, and kind of asked if I could pick your brain about getting a podcast going, what would be involved, what's it take, how hard is it worth doing, all of that stuff, and kind of started asking you some questions, told you what I wanted to do. As I recall, you said, I've been thinking about doing something very similar.
That's right.
I was kind of thinking to myself, I was hoping that you might I was like, I'm not going to ask him. I'm not going to ask him if he wants to do another podcast.
Don't lie, Chris. That was your whole agenda the whole time.
It'd be really cool if he did.
Right.
So I don't know if I baited you into it or what, subconsciously, but
I'm very easy to bait.
we both kind of had that discussion and said, yeah, what about a sweet, awesome Bible study type podcast? And when we started talking about it way back in 2018, and we're ready to launch, and we talk a little bit about what happened and why that didn't go on, and then came back to it here a couple years later. It's changed a little bit, I think, in what we were wanting to do. But as Basil had mentioned, I think on our first episode back, probably the Lord's timing. Probably that's the reason that it was supposed to go that way. So
yeah, it does feel that way. And I was stoked because just to clarify a little bit, when I said these were the conversations I wanted to get into, it was mainly for me. I mean, for me to understand and talk through what is going on in the world, what is going on in the Christian church, how obviously the criticisms of the Christian church, the American Christian church, are plentiful and sort of easy, even for those within. But it was there were theological things going on and real legit exploration, but it was getting so mixed up with politics and progressivism, and
it was either going left or right in the politics.
It was just so messy. And I mostly wanted to do a podcast so I could have an opportunity to talk through what is going on in the world. And it was, again, it was a total God thing. I believe that Chris and I apparently baited each other into doing this podcast because it is way cooler to talk about these things when you have an actual educated, smart person to bounce ideas off of and explore these things to, than just simply being a habitually podcasting man-child.
Well, and way cooler to have somebody fun and engaging to come into the conversation too, because I had mentioned this on our show that I was thinking about it, and I was like, nobody's going to want to just sit and listen to me talk for an hour at a time.
It takes some time, man. It takes some time to build a people's, and I think that's maybe a good thing. I think that's why I feel like God used, the platform Basil already had, because obviously without trying, you kind of create a fan base in a sense, or followers, and you're like, cool, that's great that they're willing to listen to things that I have. But I think we get people on like yourself, Chris, like Dr. Heiser, Dr. Mike, and all these other different people, because again, we always felt the same, that I might have similar thoughts, or I'm onto something with my own personal research, but I don't know the whole picture. So I'd rather have someone like yourself come on and then really tackle this, so it's not just Chuck saying what he thinks is going on.
It's so easy as a podcaster to be like, I am a podcaster.
Exactly.
Listen to what I have to say.
Right. It kind of comes with this. It's already the stigma now. You know what I mean? Yeah, and it's funny because I see like saying that it's. I don't know. It's like a joke now. You see it on constantly, comedians say the same joke, like, "Oh, I do a podcast." You know what I mean? And it's like, and it's just a thing now. I remember starting a podcast. There was already more of a thing, but I'm sure when you guys started, there was barely any podcast, but like, I remember Omar telling me like, "Hey, let's start a podcast," and I'm like, "Okay, first thing, what's a podcast?" You know what I mean? Like that's the first thing I said.
Totally.
And so, but now we're here, right? And so, Chris, you were saying, like, I'd like to ask you, let's get into a little bit into what your show's about and all that stuff. Why Ravel? What's going on with Ravel? I know it's a specific thing that you guys were looking for. So why are you guys calling it Ravel?
Oh boy. Well, this was a brainstorming meeting that happened. I was in my hotel room in New Orleans. I commuted back and forth. I actually kept a hotel room there permanently because I was back and forth so much between my home here in Central Florida and then up there on campus in New Orleans. And we were talking. I remember sitting there at this little desk that was in the hotel room up there, and we were talking, and we started talking about just different catchy names for things and how could it be something fun. And I brought up words that are their own antonyms. And it's just a funny thing, a word that it means the opposite of the thing that it means, like the one I can think of right now is oversight. So you say, if you have oversight over someone, then you're watching over everything they're doing, making sure that you're not missing anything. But if you have an oversight, then you have missed something. So it's like a word that can either mean you missed something or you didn't miss anything.
You blew my mind already right now. Like, that's crazy.
I
never thought of that.
These are the paradoxes or the fun things in life. But we got to talking about that, and Basil, have to give credit where credit is due, was the one who said, "Did you know that ravel means the same thing as unravel?" And as soon as he said it, I was like, I knew that was it. I was like, whoa. And I remember I was like, that's it. And I remember him, he's like, don't get too excited. Hang on. Let's just think about it for a minute.
We're still brainstorming.
But I was like, no, this is it. This is it. And then you just start thinking about the fact that the world is a big tangled ball of all of these different ideas and thoughts, and then even specifically the Bible. As I talk with more and more people, and as I have had people coming to me for years now with questions, and only because, I'm in school, not because I'm necessarily brilliant or anything, but I've been in ministry, I've been a pastor and a youth pastor and all those things, and have had people coming to me all the time with all of these questions. And I'm just like, this whole thing just seems so confusing. So how can we take this? But the thing that I really love about the idea is that it is like we have this ball, kind of as our logo, and it's like that thing is this big twisted up kind of ball, but it's actually very complex and beautiful. So what we do, what I like to do, what I think we do, is we kind of pull out one thread, and we kind of look at it, and we examine that particular thread, and then we see kind of how that fits back into the big ball, like the big picture. And that's kind of what you try to do with biblical studies. And there's all kinds of ways to look at it, but when I teach in my hermeneutics class, you talk about the 3 tiers kind of that there are in the Bible, and you have this big overarching kind of meta narrative that's going on this first tier level, and that where it's gonna be the story of the entire Bible, and then you kind of have the story between like the Testaments, this kind of smaller story where it's what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then underneath of that you have individual narratives. So as I'm teaching my classes how to understand stories, it's like you got to look at this story kind of in its immediate context, like immediately where it is, and then you have to see how it fits into the larger narrative of, the Testament, the covenant that it's relating to, and then how does this fit into the big picture of the Bible. And that's kind of one of the things that I think is our hope to do with the text of Scripture, and then kind of how that relates to some of the things that are going on in the world. Because well, I guess when we were thinking about, ideas for shows, I was thinking about it and I was like, there's a lot of really, good fringy sort of podcasts out there, which are no longer so fringy, and still trying to establish myself, in academia and with a career. I kind of keep an arm's length from some of the very fringy stuff, so I don't want to get too far into it. But I look at all of those things and I think, there's obviously some truth to all these things that are going on, right, and it's becoming more and more mainstream. But there's a lot of people doing that, and then I look over at kind of strictly Bible study sorts of podcasts and things like that, and there's a lot of really good just straight up Bible study. But I think sometimes it's kind of like, how do these two things interact with each other? Like, how does my knowledge of the Bible help me to understand what to do with the madness in the world right now? So we're kind of still, I think, feeling our way through like what this is exactly going to be, but we've been touching a little bit already on kind of current events and some of the things that are whatever trend on social media, or some of the popular ideas with, politics and some social issues, and then just doing some strictly Bible study. And I'm just really excited. My forte is really for the Bible study side of it, and Basil is, well, he's not a slouch in his Bible study for sure. You can tell, as we've mentioned on the show, he paid attention in Sunday school, and he has some Bible college under his belt. So he's no slouch, but he definitely is, the work that he does with his other podcast with Canary Cry is definitely a lot more kind of current events and things like that. Right. So what's really cool is I think you have the two of us coming together, where I spend a lot of time in biblical studies. He spends a lot of time in current events. I spend a little bit of time in current events, and we kind of have these two ideas or ways of whatever specializing where we bring them together, and hopefully it's something that's a little bit unique that people may not be finding.
No, everywhere. Yeah, I agree. I think so. I think I would call this is just, I'm being silly here, but it's like Hannah Montana. You got the best of both worlds going on.
And if I may, with the name Ravelin, going back to the sort of philosophy behind the show, I love it because I think one of the things that creates a lot of contention, even within the church, is the issue of certainty. And when I, part of the conversation about ravel, the word means, to ball something up or to ravel it, or at the same time to unravel it, to undo a tangle. And for me, sort of on a philosophical side, that is a lot of what trying to navigate through this world, being mindful of theology and being mindful of God and how we are as humans are supposed to go through this world, but also understanding the Bible, or interpreting the Bible, or approaching the Bible in conversations. A lot of times, certainty is kind of like a big problem, because you can come to an answer to something in the Bible and totally discount some very important details, but this idea that we can be absolutely certain about an answer to a question doesn't do a lot of credit to how beautiful and complex the Bible is. And in a lot of our conversations, we want to reckon with the fact that as we answer questions or as we explore a topic, more questions inevitably come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And landing, certainty can be sort of a destroyer of exploration and, a destroyer of chasing down the truth held within the Bible and within just questions that need answers. And so, we avoid trying to lay down dogma. I mean, obviously, there are certainties that we have theologically, regarding Jesus the Christ and
right.
and the salvifical issues. So I don't want anybody to think that we're trying to get anybody off the rails or anything.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
It's this openness to exploring all the truth that is possible, and that can be uncomfortable for some people.
It definitely can.
Growing up in the church, and you kind of spend a lot of time deferring to whatever your pastor on Sunday morning says, and that's good a lot of the times. But sometimes, people got to remember, pastors are just also people.
Right.
They're just people trying to figure out the same thing. And unfortunately, they are incentivized. And I'm speaking as a pastor, by the way. Chris and I both spent a lot of time in ministry, and I am also currently a pastor. There's a lot of incentivizations for pastors to be extremely certain about the answers that they give people. And unfortunately, I think that sort of contrived certainty has caused a lot of problems, not just in the institution of the church, but also in people's individual lives. Yeah. And those are things that we're trying to expound upon.
Yeah. And I mean, call me crazy, but I would rather teach something with uncertainty, kind of just not sure, but it'd be more correct and let God do something with it, right?
Yeah.
Instead of teaching something with certainty and it's completely wrung. You know what I mean? So
that's something I love about uncertainty and teaching, which is, and I think a lot more. Again, unfortunately, the pastors are sort of motivated by the congregation a lot of times. And not so much, uncertainty is frowned upon a lot of times from the pulpit.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
No, and recently I was,
it's God's job to make sense of things in the hearts of people.
No, exactly. And I guess we forget that sometimes. And I don't know, I'm sure that comes from a personal lack of faith. I speak for myself, where sometimes I say, well, this might not be received or whatever. But if I did my due diligence and I'm asking God to guide me through this, I believe where I make my mistakes, hopefully God, I know that God has the grace and power to fix where I messed up, because I'm not trying to go out there when I do teach every now and then to lead people wrong. That's the last thing I want to do, because my story, Basil. I've been on your show, and where I came from, it was just a very bad place. And I used to teach from because that's how they, exactly what you're saying. They're telling you to teach with this certainty, and that's those actual word in Spanish we used to use a lot, like certeza. You have to say it with absolute certainty that this is what it's going to be, and this is what it is. And even though it was fundamentally wrong what I was teaching, and something that I like that you said, Chris, is that you tend to now try and work with people, even though you have theological differences, and try and say these people love the Lord. And I can say a lot of those people that I met definitely did. I definitely was doing it because I thought I was doing it for God, and I was. But I just didn't know know that the organization itself had different intentions, and so it kind of reminds me of Romans, like I say a lot, it's just like a people with zeal but with no knowledge. Like they just kind of have this zeal, like, oh yeah, I want to do something for God, and whatever the pastor would say out of the pulpit, like we'll just take that to the bank no matter what it is, even if it sounds absurd,
And that's one of the reasons that I have such caution with certainty, is because as someone who has been currently a teacher and a preacher, it is kind of scary to think that the things that you're saying, people are going to take those as the gospel truth. They're going to take those as facts, and they're going to start making decisions about their lives based on these things that you're saying. They're going to start, shaping their worldview, and you're having a profound influence on people when you're given this position of a pulpit or a lectern or a microphone. So I try to be very cautious, and I don't think that I actually told Basil this, but the first episode that we did where we took listener questions, we answered them, and we kind of started off with like a little bit saying like, hey, listen, not saying any of this stuff is 100% right, but this is kind of our best take on these things. And I actually got a response back from one of the people whose questions we answered, and they said, I just want to thank you so much for not being so assertive with your answers, because I've seen so many people in the church that come to these different issues, and they make these definitive claims about stuff, and they stand up there, and it almost comes off as a little bit, kind of haughty, where they're saying like, this is the way that it is, and then you have a whole congregation of people out there, or a whole classroom, or a whole whatever internet world full of people out there coming from different backgrounds. I just had a conversation yesterday where somebody brought up just the idea of lust, and how people who have suffered abuses in their past how they take the teaching of lust that usually comes down from the pulpit, and it's like offensive to them because they've actually been sexually abused in the past. And it was something that I've never even considered it from that point before. And when I talk about it again, I'll have that to look through. But it just reminds me how often you have to be cautious. And I was out to dinner with a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine. She loves the Lord. She has loved the Lord for many, many years, and is a student of the Bible. And she was actually listening to Naked Bible with Dr. Heiser, and I'm sure he needs no, introduction or explanation amongst the listenership here. But he had on, and I can't remember the name of the guy at this point, but I had listened to it. But it was the guy who was kind of trying to give some room to like theistic evolution. And he was basically trying to say, you guys may have, if you listen to his show, you may know the one that I'm talking about, but
I kind of remember that episode. I was going to say David Burnett, but I don't think it's that. It's someone else.
Your whatever guess you have would be as good as mine. But if any, it was the topic of theistic evolution. Dr. Heiser is somebody that lots of people trust. It's really funny how much notoriety he's gained lately, because when I started listening to him, and especially even in seminary, and I'm talking about Nephilim and stuff like that, people are like, oh, don't get all crazy. This is like when I first started my PhD program. It took me about 4 years to get done. By the time I was done, I had all my the students in my cohort asking me like, yeah, you know who Dr. Michael Heiser is? I was like, yeah, he's awesome. I was like, I know. Welcome to the party. Right. But anyway, everybody listens to him. So she's listening, and she's like, I think that there might be room for theistic evolution. And I was like, well, yeah, I said, but here's the problems that I have with the guy's argument. I remember his argument. I can't remember his name. So it goes. But then I start kind of breaking apart his argument. I say, this is why I don't really, agree with it. And she's like, well, it could be. And I said, well, it could be, but I don't think that it is. And I'm not quite there yet. And then I was talking about the fact just that there's going to be people who disagree about everything, that they just will. And then she said, well, what's the point even? If this PhD is going to say this and this PhD is going to say that, then what's the point of even having why does it even matter what you believe? And I was like, well, it's about the journey, right? It's about
I was thinking of that phrase in my head, and I thought it was a little like cheesy for me, but I was thinking exactly that phrase, the journey, man.
It's about exploring these things for yourself, and especially when it comes to God, especially when it comes to his word. It's such a beautiful process of discovery as you're moving through it, but everybody's going to arrive at different places as they're going through. And one of the things that we tried to set up at the beginning of the show is just from an evangelical standpoint, to call yourself a Christian, there are things that Basil and I agree with, and most American evangelicals agree with. You must affirm these things to call yourself a Christian, and it's a very small number of things in the huge number of topics, but you must affirm these things, and there's no wiggle room there. But then after that, it's a huge world of possibility, and I think it's just really fun to kind of explore all those things and walk through them all.
Okay, exactly. So you mentioned some examples that are kind of like more in the PhD, things that, about certain things like the theistic evolution. Maybe some of my listeners don't even know what that is, but Basil, I'll ask you, because you came from a Pentecostal background, kind of similar to mine, but mine went a little bit crazier, in my opinion. I think you heard my story, yeah. So
yours was much more exciting.
Yeah. But even so, in not so exciting churches, there's definitely some issues with theology in these non-exciting churches as well. So, what's an example that you feel that you held? I don't want to get you in trouble with your mom and dad now, but I'm just trying to say. But what's an example that you feel that of something that you used to believe theologically during those times when you were, in your flag waving Pentecostal church, and that you think, what
flag ministry,
yeah, and so that has changed drastically. That you might say, oh my gosh, this is something that I just did not perceive it correctly at all.
Can I just jump in before you answer?
Hold on.
Just share a personal
we got to
testimony.
break down this flag stuff here. Chris has got a quick little Bible study on flag waving.
Yeah.
Here's my Bible study. I was at this little conference that there's this guy who's kind of like a traveling evangelist who's putting on. It was like a smaller group of people, a couple hundred people or something. So it wasn't like a arena, but we were there. They were doing worship, and I show up in my Baptist sort of self and my presentation, and I go. But I was invited. But I run in circles of people from charismatic backgrounds, but I showed up at this thing, and this lady's dancing around, like with this flag, just going nuts. And I was looking at her, and I had seen flag dancers before, but this lady, there was something about whatever she was doing, like she's just like throwing the Holy Spirit on people with this flag, where I was just standing back looking at it like in awe. I was like, this is so beautiful and so very cool, and I'm now the biggest flag fan in the world. From my Baptist background, I was like, let's have more flags. We need flags.
That's awesome.
Every church. So I didn't mean to take away from your.
If you put a flag on on my bow staff, I'll probably make that look beautiful too.
Hey.
Well, that's good. I'm going to thank you for coming to the defense of the flag wavers, Chris. And
I love it.
Just to clarify. Yeah, I was never necessarily a part of any sort of flag waving ministry, but being in the position that I was at the time, you got the flaggers, but you also need some flagger wranglers, because you need to have all the flaggers in a special place, because there's, you got some of these, they're mostly women, mostly ladies, and they're waving around 6-foot flags. And especially if you're in a small building, like that's an actual hazard to people's health and domes. And so often it was my job to just sort of wrangle the flaggers so they can go to a safe space without, knocking anybody in the head. But okay, so back to the question.
I'm sorry, I'm just imagining them doing like accidentally hitting somebody and they knock them out.
I'm wondering how many people got knocked out.
Yeah, and then when they wake up, they're like, "You got the Holy Spirit, man." That's what it was,
It did happen. It did not happen. People would get knocked in the head occasionally if I wasn't doing my job right. But pastor refers to being a shepherd, and I was basically a shepherd of flagging sheep.
I see.
I had to lead them beside still waters and in an open area of the room where they wouldn't hurt anybody. So, okay, but back to the question, which is there anything you're kind of referring to maybe like what my journey has been from the tradition that I was raised up in, and maybe if there's a specific sort of theological difference that I maybe have left behind or moved through.
Yeah, or like me and Omar, for example, there's, like you said earlier, pretty much if it's not a salvific issue, we hold it with an open hand at this point.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I'm okay with you saying, it's pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, no rapture, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yes, okay, well, we'll see. We'll see,
It's so interesting because so many Pentecostals or charismatics have really important theological aspects that they had to sort of leave behind. And that I totally support that. Whatever you got to do, again, is part of the journey, man. Right. I'm thankful. I'm thankful that I want to be clear. By no means do I, despise my past or upbringing or group. In fact, I'm really grateful for it, and I think it was the best thing that I could have been involved with at the time, and to a degree still am. I mean, let's be clear. If if somebody asked me straight up, like, I don't know, are you a Pentecostal or a charismatic? I probably wouldn't answer in the affirmative, but I have no absolute, I have no problem identifying with those I guess labels is what they are. The biggest difference theologically, I would say maybe one of the only ones that I really have any sort of strong feeling towards or any discernible shift, again, like you said, that I don't just, keep with an open hand, is the modern sort of prophet thing. Mm-hmm. Not that they don't exist or theological, it doesn't make sense. It totally is. But in my upbringing, I came in contact with a lot of traveling prophets, a lot of speakers.
You know why they travel, right?
Yeah, they can't stay in one place. They can't stay too long to see if their prophecies come true or not.
Yeah. They be getting stoned in old times, baby.
Yeah. And as a pastor's kid, where these prophets were coming through, I was a prime target for prophecy. I was almost always prophesied over and I'm saying like maybe hundreds and hundreds of times would I be brought up and sort of publicly prophesied over by, in some cases, some extremely famous prophets. I mean, I won't necessarily drop names, but if you're familiar with sort of that movement and any number of the sort of well-known prophecy types in America, mm-hmm. I've been prophesied over by them.
Wow.
And
no pressure, buddy.
Celebrity prophecies.
Well, and you get right into it, Chris, because that's the big problem. That is a lot of pressure for a young person coming up, having huge prophetic names, speaking prophecies over me in front of my parents, in front of my congregation, sometimes on television, like over.
Wow.
And they were all very big, all very grand, and some of them, I'm just going to say it, complete nonsense.
Right.
But you just go through it. You think, I'm being gracious. I'll accept it. That's fine. Thank you very much. God bless you. I'll certainly pray about that. And sometimes conflicting. How can one prophet say something that conflicts with another prophet? Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing is I certainly don't take every traveling prophet with the seriousness that they sort of regard themselves with. I don't know. That might be sort of a politician way to say it. But,
yeah, that was good. You danced around that really good. I like that.
Thank you. I'm just trying to please everybody.
Yeah,
I'm going to run in for office.
Just in case, man. Yeah.
But the biggest reason this is the case is because that actually had some pretty intense effects on my psychology for a very long time.
Yes.
You grow up for years. I'm talking decades, over decades, hundreds of these prophecies being spoken over me. I certainly had a pretty grand idea about what my future would look like.
Right.
And, with prophecies, things like this, it rarely does it come with instructions, and rarely does it come with an action plan on how to make these things happen.
Right.
So, I started getting my late 20s, early 30s, and these prophecies are looking further and further away.
Right.
And I'm starting to think, well, what am I doing? Am I displeasing God? Is that why these prophecies aren't happening? Am I doing something wrong? Am I not in God's will? Is that why, I'm not this famous movie star or whatever any number of the prophecies might have said? And it really, as I grew into a young adult, it had a very big impact on how I saw myself, how I saw my life path, my choices, my performance in certain career aspects, things like that. And luckily, I've come to a place in my life where I don't need to take all those things so seriously. And just because a prophecy that was spoken over me by some big famous prophet has not come true, that doesn't mean that I am outside of God's will. It does not mean that I am, displeasing the Lord with what I do, these sorts of things. So that's kind of the biggest one that I've set aside or left behind.
Right. Well, I think the argument stands, or what we're trying to present, I should say, is exactly that. Like, when we approach the Bible without understanding and we just kind of go, the ramifications is always the people and the followers have different kinds of ramifications. Like you said, it affected you psychologically and you were questioning your walk. Like, what's going on? What am I doing wrong? And I experienced a lot of that myself, coming from a very, very strong health and wealth, prosperity doctrine kind of church. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Where you can pretty much move the hand of God based on just how much you were giving him. And some of these people that would call themselves prophets in the moment would say, well, God's telling me. And this would happen so much, and it was horrible, because God's telling me right now that if someone gives their car, or if someone gives their house,
right.
God's going to bless you with that thing that you need. Maybe you have a family member who's sick or something like that, so you need to turn over. You need to sell the house and turn it in, And people would do that, And sometimes you would see some pretty miraculous things where it's like, whoa, that person definitely got healed from something. And that, to me, that always now I question it even more. It's like, was some of that even God doing that? Like, definitely God can do those things, but some of that was I feel like it was even the devil, or evil spirits, or whatever you want to call it, stepping in and just, putting on a show, like in Egypt with Moses versus those other prophets. It's like I felt like there were false miracles sometimes, and I would say that because there was people that were definitely healed, for sure, from impossible diseases, but sometimes the financial ramification was way worse, where they're just kind of suffering now to try and get them back on their feet because they gave everything they had. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of that, and it's just then they were questioning, well, what else could I do? And sometimes they would just bust out the pastors or so-called prophet. They would say, well, you're not using enough faith, and you need to have faith more, and it's really up to them to because if you had one doubt, then that's why God didn't bless you entirely. And it's like, well, just that's all it takes. Dang,
what a difficult standard for God to set.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If one little moment of doubt could totally destroy, the future that God has planned for you, is such a difficult theological concept.
Which is why I have an issue with certainty now.
To protect.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's just
I struggled with that with my own salvation for a while, because the evangelists would always come, whether it was the summer camp as a youth group or whatever, even your pastor every Sunday. It was very common in at least the Baptist church, in the circles that I grew up in. It may have been in other churches too, but they would use this line: if you don't know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you're saved, then you need to, pray and ask the Lord or whatever.
Right.
And I was like, I feel like I always have a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
Right.
The
Like there's at
demanding
least
of
a
certainty.
little.
Right.
So then I'm like feeling constantly like, am I saved? If I'm doubting right now, does that mean I'm not saved? If my faith saves me and my faith isn't strong enough to know that I'm actually saved, then am I? And I had this like very like years long like internal turmoil, but just because of the language that was being used from the pulpit. If you don't know beyond a shadow of a doubt, and I heard it all the time, and I was like, I have a shadow of a doubt. I'm not sure. I don't even know if God's real. What is going on? And like it throws you into this complete panic. But eventually, at some point, the Lord did give me certainty, and as much certainty as a person can have. I'm happy to tell you all that I have now. There may still be a shadow of a doubt if I'm being honest, like from time to time, like I don't know, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, personally.
But, all of these things, we have to be so careful about what we're throwing out there for people.
Indeed.
Speaking real quick, just speaking of being careful about what we throw out there, I do also want to be fair to say that there were prophecies that did come true. I mean, some real miraculous things.
Mm-hmm.
I will say it almost entirely were the prophecies that were done not on stage, not in front of a crowd, not performative, but and usually not from a famous person. But the idea that modern prophecy exists, I don't necessarily have any problem with, especially because there were some very sweet, kind, humble, usually women, church women, who would get a word or something and give me that word, and it was something about something about something, and there were some very miraculous prophetical things that happened. So I guess that's kind of the more precise answer, which is I don't believe that nobody can hear from God. But coming out of that tradition, I esteem performative prophecies quite a bit less than I was taught to when I was a kid.
Well, it's really funny because in the Baptist church, right? So we would always in the Lifeway material, which Lifeway creates all the Sunday school material for all of the Baptist churches. And if you're a good Baptist church, you're buying the Lifeway material, and that's what everybody's getting taught. But in that curriculum, every year there would be some spiritual gifts test, right? So, and then they have to, of course, go through the text of Scripture to find out the spiritual gifts. And one of those spiritual gifts is prophecy, right? But you're in a Baptist church, so they're like, well, what do we do with prophecy? And then in the Baptist church, prophecy is simply, it's preaching. It's proclaiming the word, right? And in a sense, their understanding of it is not wrong. Prophecy is you receive a word from the Lord. It's a divine word from the Lord that the prophet gets, and then they disseminate that to whoever it is. So they're not wrong, but I don't think it's specifically the right thing. So I can remember never being too certain about, these prophets and these people who got words of prophecy for people and stuff. I believed sure it could happen from the pulpit, but come down off the pulpit and you just start talking to me directly. I don't know. I'm going to be a little suspicious, but I actually had a moment where I ended up having to preach a funeral, the first funeral I ever preached for what happened to be a friend of mine. A very, very strange story. Our pastor had just fallen ill. I was the youth pastor at the time. There's nobody else really there to do it. Family wants to have the funeral at the church. One of the head deacons comes up to me. He's like, you got to do this thing. And I was like, I went to high school with this kid, man. Like, I don't know. But I did it. I got up there, it was crazy too, because everybody from my high school showed up. And the last time they had all seen me, I was probably on drugs or at some party or something. And I didn't even know they were there because I was so nervous. I was sitting in the front row just staring like, Lord, you have to help me. This is crazy. I don't know what I'm doing here. This is so crazy. I've never done a funeral before. And I get up on stage and turn around and look, and it's like everybody from my high school is sitting in the pews. I'm like, you have to be kidding me. But the Lord gave me the strength, and I actually shared my testimony. The young man who died, actually, it was a drug overdose. Got to talk about drugs. It was crazy. The Lord was like in the thing. But he had an uncle who was there, who was a pastor from a charismatic church up north, and he came down for the funeral. He also participated in the service, and he gave a word at the end. But he grabbed me afterward in the little reception area, and I was going around doing the pastor thing, shaking hands with everybody and doing all of that stuff. And he comes up to me and pulls me aside, and he just started talking like to my soul in a way that like I had never experienced before. And I'm like, what is happening right now? And it was like the guy had been reading my mail, to use the colloquialism, for like the last months. I was going through a really hard time in my life, and he just starts speaking like directly to all of these issues, encouraging me where I need to be encouraged, reminding me of these things that the Lord has said, telling me, what the Lord has for me and all of these different things. And it was like to the point where I had no explanation for it, except I was like, this is directly from the mouth of the Lord right now. And I became a believer in that moment. I was like, okay, this is real. I don't know why it's not happening here at our church, but this is a real thing. And I have seen it in my life. But as Basil was saying, I think that there becomes this, I think that what happens is a lot of these guys, there's this pressure. Like God may only ever want to use a person to give one prophetic word ever. Like you may be a guy that he gives one prophetic word to, and you give it to some guy, or you say it about something, and that's it. And he just wanted to get that message to this person or these people through you. But then this pressure comes on you where you feel like, either like that was really cool and I really loved being a part of what the Lord was doing there, or maybe you start to love the praise of men, or maybe there's just people are looking at you like, what else is the Lord telling you? And you're like, I can't tell nothing, but it's really nothing. And then people start making stuff up, and I have no idea how it all goes, but I'm in that camp where I would agree with Basil with that particular experience. This is definitely real. It definitely happens, but there's definitely a lot of people out there too who exploit it.
Well, when your career path is office of the prophet, there's a lot of pressure to perform. And the pastor's kid is a great way to make sure you get invited back.
Yeah. There you go. You were just a little pawn. Basil.
It happens. It happens. Man, we're all pawns once in a while.
You're doing pretty good for a PK kid,
I was curious though. I really want to know right now, like, how do you bat? Because you kind of like downplayed maybe even some of the significance of what you're doing in your life right now. But I mean, when you're reaching a lot of people with some really important information. So, I mean, like, do you feel like, movie star, I heard you say, I don't know that you've done.
Oh, it was everything. I was supposed to be a millionaire like 3 years ago. I was supposed to, it was everything. It was everything big. I was, it's no secret. I was into, the film and television industry for a while, in production and things like that. No big deals or anything, but, I had prophets telling me that I was going to make the next Lord of the Rings, and how the Lord was already in the works. And I can't even remember. It's just hundreds of them.
Not gonna lie, Basil, when I first met you, I was like, you know what, he can be a good Legolas, you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
The Viking blood.
Yeah,
and man. Again, and I don't want to just get the whole show wrapped up in all this, but yeah, that is, thank you. And that is part of the interesting part of it, which is, yes, I've been very blessed. Part of it is I've been podcasting since 2012, which was really early. That was back in the day that nobody knew what a podcast was. And certainly none of us podcasters thought that it would become so mainstream. And, I'm very grateful for the position and the accomplishments that I've been given. And I feel, so I can't remember if a prophet ever brought me up on stage and said, you are going to be sort of a blue-collar, mid-level podcaster in super niche areas that will never gain any mainstream attention. But if that did happen, then that guy was spot on.
He's spot on, yeah. Same here. Well, I would have never imagined being here, but Chris, we hate to have you here and not use you specifically for something a little bit deeper when it comes to the Bible and misinterpreting. I think you brought something up that was very important. It's part of your dissertation, if my memory serves me right. And on this previous episode before this one, I'm not sure if I'm releasing it yet with right behind this other one, but you know him, Basil. We had Nikolai Peterson on, actually, and he's a pastor as well. And part of his studies was, part of the conversations we had was it was kind of deciphering certain meanings of things that we often use incorrectly in the Bible. And then obviously there's so many, so we can go on for hours, weeks, months on just this subject alone, because there's so many misinterpretations, and that's where hermeneutics comes into play, right? And so if people don't know what that is, because we have all sorts listening to the show, can you kind of explain what that means, hermeneutics, and then can we kind of set up your dissertation and give an example? Because I personally had a question about this specific thing when I think when we spoke, I had told you I had just mentioned a version of it to my daughter, and it kind of blew her mind, but I also felt guilty because I said it in a way where I think I could have rephrased it better, which I'm going to backtrack and give her some other insight, but especially after, you say what you have to say right now. But I wanted to wait to hear you say this. But the verse we're speaking of is when Jesus tells God, Father, why did you abandon me? When he's on the cross. And I gave her a version of it, which is not your regular version. And the version that you mostly hear when that comes up is when pastors talk about it, is well, God didn't want to look at him because he was carrying the sin of the world on him, and so God has no part with sin, so he had to in that moment let him just walk that path, and he can't be a part of his life in that moment because he's carrying the sin of the world, the sin of all human beings. So that is how that is used. But if you want to set that up, if there's something we need to know before you get into that, please explain hermeneutics a little bit, and then let's get into that.
Yeah. Well, hermeneutics, just real quick, comes from the Greek word, which just means to interpret. So hermeneutics is simply just the English transliteration, basically, that gets turned. It's used for interpretation, and it's how do you interpret anything really, but when it comes to biblical studies, it refers to the interpretation of the text of Scripture. So when you say hermeneutics, that's really all it means, is how do we interpret the text of Scripture. Now when you get into the actual discipline of it, it's something that apparently you can get a PhD in, because there's so much nuance, there's so many different stages, there's so many different levels, so many different approaches, different ways that people come to the text of Scripture, and people have spent years identifying these particular avenues. And I'm just going to reference my bookshelf right here. There's, I don't know, probably 30, 40 books in my small collection here on how to interpret Scripture, and they all are going to be a little bit different. So everybody's got these different approaches on how do we come to the text of Scripture and understand it appropriately, and everybody's got a way that they think maybe it's not the best way, but provides particular value. And this is one of the things that they kind of teach us to do. Each one of these different approaches is a tool in the toolbox, and it may work here, and you may need it over here. And anybody who does any work with their hands and any work with tools knows that sometimes, a flathead screwdriver is good for taking out a screw, and sometimes it makes a really good chisel. A chisel makes the best chisel, however, though. But there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, I guess you could say. There's a lot of different ways to come to the text of Scripture and understand it. So the difficulty, one of the things that Basil and I have talked quite a bit about on the show, is that I think a lot of people have this idea, and maybe just because they've never been told otherwise, that they can come to the text of Scripture and that they can just read it and understand it with no, prerequisite knowledge, with no background information, without anything. I think a lot of people believe that they can just sit down and understand what they're reading. And we just actually recorded an episode at the time we're recording this one right now. We just released it yesterday, where we took a question and somebody asked us, how do I approach the Bible, and what should I expect? And I never want to tell anybody, like, unless you go get a PhD, you can't understand the Bible. That's certainly not true. And I don't even mean to tell people, unless you've read this book or this commentary, like, obviously you don't need a degree. You can read all the books that I've ever read and know everything that I have without the degree. The degree really doesn't mean anything. But I don't even mean to tell people that you can't understand the Bible without reading these things. The Bible is a living word, and God can speak to people in incredible ways who have, no extra knowledge, who are just a regular 21st century Midwestern housewife can sit down and open her Bible and the Lord can show her wonders. Not going to say that can't happen. However, when you start to understand some of this extra information, some of this background information, some of the context, as I know that you were wanting to talk about biblical context, it starts to open up all of these different avenues. And there are some things that just at a surface level reading, and we actually answered a question, Basil and I, just on the last episode we released too, out of 1 John, where there's a surface level reading where it's almost like the Bible seems contradictory, or it's very hard to understand what it is that John is trying to tell us, in this letter without a little bit more information. Sometimes it doesn't matter that much, but sometimes you can really get yourself into some trouble. And I found a long time ago, I think I might have been in Bible college. I think I might have had just started Bible college, or it might have been just before that. And I remembered hearing, what was probably a Good Friday or some kind of Easter sermon. And I remember pastor talking about, the crucifixion narrative. And I don't remember, it shows up in Matthew and it shows up in Mark. Most scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel written. They're in the order that they are, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, because the fathers believed, the people who put the Bible into order believed that that's how they were written, in that order: Matthew first, then Mark, then Luke, and then John. However, as they've gone through some different, looking at the text and things like that, they actually believe that Mark might have been the first gospel written. It's kind of neither here nor there, but I was doing a study on this. It shows up in Matthew and Mark. Talking to my advisor, he said you should probably use Mark. So I used Mark. Ended up really, really getting into the Gospel of Mark. It used to be my least favorite gospel, and now I'm like, it's so well done. It's such a great depiction of Jesus.
Same here. I was like, for some reason, I had liked other ones, and then now it's one of my favorites. We kind of did a show on that a little bit about Mark and what you were just saying. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me in particular, I like that Matthew and Luke include birth narratives. I mean, it's kind of cool to see the birth narrative, right. And then John, and Basil and I just talked about this too. John has his own birth narrative, but his birth narrative is, in the beginning was the Word, right. And that is his birth story. That is, okay, Jesus, he never was born. He was always there. So the other three Gospels actually have birth narratives, and Mark is just like, he showed up in the desert one day. He showed up out in the wilderness. Here he was. Right. He just drops you right into it. But anyhow, when he gets to his crucifixion narrative, and it's down in Mark 15:34, and he's Jesus on the cross, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's the only line from the cross that Mark puts on the lips of Jesus. It's the only thing that Mark says that Jesus said from the cross is, my God, why have you forsaken me? So it's obviously very important to him, this thing. And it's like, if there's going to be one thing that you say from the cross, like, why is it that? And, it got me to thinking. And then my pastor, of course, brings it up. And then he says the very same thing that you said. I do not fault you at all for explaining to your daughter what you explained to her, because that's the way that it's been explained to you, and that's the way that it's been explained to almost everybody, is that Jesus taking on the sins of the world. So the Father had to, at the very least, turn his face away from Jesus, because he couldn't stand to look at him. He couldn't look at sin. He couldn't look at Jesus taking on the sin. And then you have some people who are even going to go so far as to say that the Father cut Jesus off from himself, right? And you hear this a lot. And there's been lots of books that have been written. There's systematic theologies. There's very sound, very brilliant evangelical scholars who will say the same thing. And I just had a really hard time with the concept of the Trinity. And I'm like, if the Trinity, what we know about the Trinity is that God is three persons and yet he's one. And then you get looking back into the doctrine of the Trinity, and you get looking back into what the church fathers have said from the beginning, what the Bible tells us about the triune God, what the Bible tells us about the relationship between the Father and the Son in particular. Then I just start thinking to myself, is it possible that God can cut himself off from himself? And if one of the fundamental elements of what it is to be God is his triuneness, then if he stops being triune, then is he still God? And is Jesus still God? If he gets cut off from the Father, does Jesus cease being God? And I start having all of these questions, and I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And a lot of people just chalk it up to, well, it's a mystery and we'll just never know. But this is what the Bible says. The Bible says that the Father forsook the Son, so that's what happened, and here's why it happened. And then they start teaching it to people, and then I start thinking, this feels like it's getting actually dangerously close to some kind of heresy. And I'm certainly not accusing any pastor who's ever taught this before of being a heretic. I am not whatsoever doing that, because I realize that the vast majority of pastors and the vast majority of Christians who have ever come to this text understand it in this way. But
Hey,
when
I did it once. I've been unintentionally heretical, so
we're all a heretic to somebody.
Right,
it's true. I say it's coming dangerously close. I don't say that it is heresy. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm just saying, to say that the Father and the Son can be separated, to say that the Trinity did not exist for for 3 hours, for whatever period of time you want to say, the whole time Jesus was dead until he was resurrected, you're saying that the Trinity didn't exist. You're saying the Father and the Spirit were over here, presumably the Spirit. Nobody really even talks about the Spirit when it comes to the crucifixion. But the Father and the Spirit are over here, just being like, well, we can't have him as being a part of us anymore. He's filthy and dirty, so we're going to cut him off and just leave him to die. And then we'll resurrect him. We'll resurrect him later, and then he comes back, and then the Trinity's reunited. It's like, well, if the Trinity is not eternal, if it didn't exist for 3 hours, then it's not eternal. Eternal is eternal. Forever is forever. There is,
uninterrupted.
What we see in James, there's no shifting, in the person of who God is. He's the same yesterday, today, forever. So then you have to start thinking about, well, what is going on here? What is going on here if the Father can't be cut off from the Son, or vice versa? What is actually going on? And this brings in a particular discipline called intertextuality. And this is one of the areas where it's a really, really fun area of study. And intertextuality, it can mean a lot of different things, but in biblical studies, what intertextuality means is it's when the New Testament authors cite the Old Testament. And when a New Testament author cites the Old Testament, how did they do that? And one of the things that we talk about all the time, and people are very familiar with it, and you talk about it in every hermeneutics class, and you talk about it in every sermon or whatever, you start getting in discussions about things, and people make a point and they use some verse, and people will say, you're using that verse out of context. You're taking that verse out of context. So we have this idea in biblical interpretation today that we know that you can't just yank a verse, just pluck it out from all of its surrounding verses, from the book that it's written in, from the Bible, and just take a verse and say, this is what it says, so this is what it means. You have to say, well, what else is going on in that verse? Why did the author say that particular thing? So you draw the whole context in so that you can understand what's going on.
And the Bible does that quite often, right?
What's that?
The Bible does that quite often, right? Like it cross-references other texts. Like I think you guys posted an image. I think it's your last post on Instagram, at least. I think it says, created by Chris Harrison, is a visual display of 63,779 cross-references that occur in the Bible. That's pretty insane right there.
Yeah, it is. It is nutty. And not all of those, I mean, they Yeah, I mean, they basically are intertextual. Some of them, their origin is in the Old Testament, and then they're just simply fulfilled in the New Testament, and that's one thing. And the New Testament author is going to go back and say this thing was written way back here, and then it happened here. But then there's other times when what they're doing is they're kind of taking the context in the New Testament that they're in, and it's more of kind of like a typology where they're looking back at something that has happened in the Old Testament and seeing how that thing was a prefiguring of the thing that was yet to come. But yeah, it happens some 63,000 times. It is one of the very incredible things. It's one of the things that is a attestation to the authenticity and authority of the text of Scripture is that any scholar is going to look back at these things and realize, this was written 4,000 years ago, and it says this thing, and then we know, through history outside of the Bible that this thing happened over here, some 2,000 years later or whatever, and it authenticates the Bible, the fact that these prophecies, became fulfilled. And it works that way from the Old Testament into the New. But then in intertextuality, generally what you're doing is you're looking at how a New Testament author looks back to the Old Testament, sees a story that was told there, and sees how that same story is kind of going on in the context that they're in right now. We presume that every time they did that, and it has been demonstrated in almost every instance, well, I mean, you can't say necessarily in everyone, but people categorize all of these things as allusions, echoes, quotations. There's nuance to how whether they're just kind of making a passing reference to it or whether it's a direct quotation. What we have here with Jesus and his words from the cross, and what a lot of people don't understand, is that this is actually a direct quotation from the Old Testament. And it is a direct quotation from Psalm 22. And if you turn to your Bible and you go to Psalm 22 and you start reading Psalm 22, the very first line of Psalm 22 is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Very explicit words, very intentional, hard to get those confused, hard to say those words without drawing everybody's attention to Psalm 22. So then you have to start thinking about who was Mark, who was Mark's audience, what was going on here. Mark was a Jew. He had a mixture probably of a Jewish and Gentile audience who were living in Rome in the first century, sometime in the 60s AD. They were undergoing intense persecution from Rome, being hunted down, being killed, being crucified themselves. And that's the context that he's writing into. But one of the things that we know about the early church is that the early church, if there was any text of Scripture that the early church was going to be familiar with, it would have been the book of Psalms. Their songs. Basil and I just talked about this too. It's almost like we're doing the whole episode again here. It's so timely. But the Psalms are songs, right? And it's like I can say the first line of any particular song, to you that's in contemporary worship right now, and the going joke is it will just only be that one line repeated over and over and over again. Although I don't think that's particularly true, and I think there's some really incredible worship that's coming out right now. Or a hymn,
not the ones I sing, man.
You can say the first line. Basil, you do like worship. Give us an example of just give me the first line of. I can't think of any songs right now from the church.
I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to with the good contemporary Christian music. Burn, Christian music, burn.
Oh, man.
I got you. Christian music.
What songs do you guys do? Give me the first line of any song you do at your church.
Well, I have not led worship in a long time. And also, our church is online right now. So.
Oh, man.
Okay, well, there's, what about like Reckless Love? Everyone,
yeah.
Everyone likes that one. Of the contemporary music people, you know what I mean? They talk about.
Yeah, well, even that you say the the title of the song, and everybody and the overwhelming, right. Like everybody's okay. We're all singing in our heads now.
Right.
What Mark does is he references a psalm here, right? So they hear the first line of this psalm, and maybe an easier way for me to even do it is just to say, like with Psalm 23, like everybody's familiar with it, the Lord is my shepherd. And I don't have to say anything else, and you're already thinking, I shall not want. And he leads me beside still waters, like Basil with the flag wavers and things like that. Right. I mean, it's like the whole thing starts coming back to your mind already. What's really interesting, we see that New Testament authors did this when they cited the Old Testament. If you take the one line that they used from the Old Testament, you go back and read what's going on in the Old Testament there, the context of that Old Testament passage almost always overlaps the context in the New Testament where they're using it. So the New Testament author observes this thing that's going on, and they say, this is really similar to this thing back here in the Old Testament. So they draw a piece of the Old Testament, drop it into their story, and almost every time the broader context of that Old Testament passage overlaps the context of the New Testament passage. This is demonstrated through Mark over and over and over again. He does this from the very onset of his gospel.
Right. So what is happening, and I think a lot of the writers of the New Testament, including Jesus himself, I guess, and even in his last moments of life, is trying to refer you intentionally back to something that he's already promised that is happening. Is that what you're saying? Like he's saying, hey, I want you to pay attention to this prophecy, right? Because this thing is happening, and it's happening right before your eyes right now.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly the point. So you go and you read Psalm 22 now. So, okay, Jesus just quoted the first line of Psalm 22. The readers of Mark's gospel and even the people standing there watching the crucifixion are going to be almost helpless in thinking about Psalm 22 when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? They're almost probably going to start reciting it in their heads. And then he goes on, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it would take way too long, but I'm just going to grab a couple of the verses that are in there. So like verse 7, he says, all who see me mock me. They hurl insults at me, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let the Lord deliver him, since he delights in him. Mark and Matthew both tell us that the Pharisees who are standing there watching Jesus, they're mocking him, and they say this very same thing to him. They say, you trust in the Lord? If you're the Lord's chosen one, let the Lord deliver you. And this same sort of thing is happening. The psalmist is going on and he's describing all of this terrible stuff. He says, God, he's not listening to me. I'm being persecuted here. You're not hearing my cries. I'm surrounded by my enemies. In verse 14, he says, I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax and is melted within me. You get this really strange sort of thing that happens, right? When Jesus gets stuck in his side and you have this blood and water coming out of there, this strange sort of thing that's going on with the heart. He says, my mouth is dried up like a potsherd, like a piece of dried clay, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. Jesus, one of the other things that we know that he says is that he's thirsty. He's dehydrating. He says, dogs surround me, a pack of villains. This is all Psalm 22. A pack of villains encircles me. And then very strangely, David, in this vision he's being given, or in this hyperbolic sort of poem he's writing, he says, they pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and they gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments. And it's like anybody standing, watching what's taking place at the cross, hearing Jesus say those words, and then starts thinking about Psalm 22, is instantly saying to themselves, wow, prophecy is being fulfilled in this moment. This whole scene was already foretold. This whole thing was already foretold 1,000 years ago with David. David already saw this whole thing. But so this is what's crazy. The gospel authors, some people aren't sure if they're actually standing around seeing what's going on, or if they're drawing off of Psalm 22 here, that they actually see the connection that happens. But you have all these corollaries going on that we've just pointed out. What's very, very interesting is that Psalm 22 is a psalm of lament. It's a psalm of individual lament. It's a psalm of the individual who surveys their current situation, and they have lost any hope that God sees them, that God hears them, that God cares about them, and that God's going to deliver them. So psalms of lament will always go through this part where the psalmist is describing this terrible state that they're in, how awful it is. They can't believe it. God's nowhere to be found. They're going to die. They're staring basically death in the face. But then with every psalm of lament, there's always this point where the psalm turns and where this hope is injected into the psalm, where the psalmist realizes, no, all hope is not lost. No, God is still on my side. And that happens right here in Psalm 22. And in verse 24, in verse 22, he turns from all this lament and goes into this hymn of praise that concludes the psalm. And he says, I will declare your name to my people in the assembly. I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel. Verse 24, for he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. So, if you are doing this, understanding the biblical context here, taking into consideration this idea of the intertextual usage that the New Testament authors have, where they're drawing back on these Old Testament texts and pulling the whole context of the verse that they're citing into the new context, then what you see is the real message of Psalm 22 is not that the person who's being afflicted has been forsaken, but the fact that they have not been forsaken. They feel as though, and it looks as though, to everyone standing around who's witnessing this, it looks like everyone is looking at that person saying, surely God has forgotten them. Surely God has given them over to their enemies. But the actual message at the end of it is no. God will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He is there. He has heard your cry. He has seen your affliction, and your deliverance is coming. So the message then of the psalm that Mark is bringing in is that the afflicted one has not been forsaken. He's not been forgotten. Deliverance is actually coming. So then you have to start asking all of these questions. Well, it seems that we don't need to take that verse in Mark. We don't need to take Jesus' statement from the cross, the cry of dereliction, as a statement of fact. It seems rather that he's drawing us back to some kind of biblical prophecy, which is being fulfilled right now in these events, which actually tells us that he's not being forsaken, that the Lord is hearing him, the Lord is going to deliver him. Then you have to start making sense of, well, okay, so then now what does all this mean in a Trinitarian sense? Or what does all of this mean, and what is Jesus' deliverance going to look like? And then one of the very beautiful things about this, the psalm of the lament of the individual, is that everybody who goes back and you do all these studies in the Psalms, and everyone who looks at these and does this form critical type of approach to the Psalms realizes that the individual is standing in as a representative for the community. So every time these Psalms were written and performed, even sometimes by the king, even sometimes by David, David is standing as a representative for the entire community. So David is saying this thing, speaking symbolically for Israel at the time, actually pointing forward to Jesus, who's the one who will be the ultimate fulfillment of this song, who Jesus then is saying it, and he is being the representative for all of the people, namely those same people who Mark is writing to, who are feeling like they have been forsaken by God, who are feeling like, I just gave up everything in my life to follow after Jesus, and now we have these Romans who are finding us, they're hunting us down, they're nailing us to crosses, they're killing us in front of our families, or our families in front of us. God has surely forsaken us, and that is why Mark, at the end of this, puts these as the last words on Jesus' lips. My God, why have you forsaken me? And what everybody would have eventually arrived at, Mark's audience, what they would have eventually come to is he didn't forsake him. And then they would have eventually arrived at, and he has not forsaken us. Even though we are facing this same death, even though we are going to the same cross, he has not forsaken us. When it seems like all hope is lost, yet our deliverance comes through the resurrection of Jesus, and that is where the deliverance comes. It takes 3 days, right? But the deliverance comes. And
but it's so amazing because it's exactly the words they need to hear, because they're thinking, wait a minute, my Savior is dying. You know what I mean? Like they're thinking like this is it. I thought he was going to, you know, a lot of them seemed like he was going to overthrow and like have this whole physical, you know, overthrowing the kingdom and his establishment of the kingdom then and there. And so they were just waiting for him to wage war. But instead of that, he's right there on the cross getting nailed by the people that were oppressing the Jews, you know. And so it just makes sense that those are the exact words that he would be saying, you know.
And the implications are even more important today, because you think about the sort of theological structure of how the gospel is given and preached here in America. Excuse me for a second. You know, the preaching that, yes, at this moment when Jesus bore all the sins of the world, the Father turned his back and could not even look upon his Son. And yet Christians are taught like, hey, even when you mess up, even when you sin, God still loves you. God is still, with you. But inherent in that theology is a contradiction, being like, well, I don't know, man, because Jesus bore the sin of the world and God turned his back on him. And I sure feel like I am bearing the sins of the world, at least my little world. And I'm supposed to believe that God's not turning his back on me. It's just not consistent.
Exactly.
And so, it's this type of biblical context and this sort of critical, hardworking theology that Chris has laid out here. Why it's so important, because when a pastor heard a preaching once or was taught that, yes, the God did have to turn his back, and that's why sin is so bad. Sin is so bad that God couldn't even look upon his son when he bore it. And yet, don't worry, none of your sins are too bad for God. He's with you, brother.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. I don't even think, people are thinking about it that way.
Right.
But it does introduce sort of a spirit, if you will, a spirit of contradiction within the church body. And the sort of practical theology happening in Christian circles that contributes to, I don't know, a sort of uneasiness or an incongruency or even just an anxiety that doesn't need to be there.
I think it feeds, like you just said, especially if you are maybe a fairly new believer, but not necessarily a baby believer. But once you start going down the path of reading the Bible, which many people confuse with Bible study, which it's not, but they're just reading through it. They'll see stuff like this, and they're coming to their own conclusions, and they're trying to learn, but there seems to be like if you're a little bit if you're catching the language, there seems to be contradictions where you're like, well, why does God say this over here, but over here it doesn't, and they're not making these cross references or this intertextual thing that you're saying because they don't know that they're there, and they just say, and especially where I used to go, it was reading the Bible was more like it was just like you needed to eat food, so just go read it so that you can feed yourself spiritually. But there was no real necessity to fully understand it. That was up to them to tell you what it means, And so your job was only to stay nourished spiritually. And the way you did that is just by opening the book. You don't have to get it. You know what I mean? And so that led to all sorts of problems because everybody was coming to different conclusions, and then of course they would quote unquote be corrected by the pastor or the prophet or whoever and say, oh no, well, this is what that actually means, but it was all just kind of twisted to fit into the theology of the church, and but there you go. This one is a very general, which is this is why I wanted to bring it up, because it's a cross-denominational problem. You know what I mean? This specific verse, like most churches say this, and that's why I really wanted to bring that up, But you mentioned John earlier, and I just kind of want to speak to it a little bit before we changed it a little bit. But John is doing the same thing. So going back to Mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the conclusions we came to in the episode that we did prior, I think it's called Archetypes and Symbols. We did it with Matt Miller. Do you guys know who the YouTube channel Logos Made Fresh, or no Logos Made Flesh? Sorry.
No, I don't think I've seen it.
I'm making a note right now.
Yeah, so Logos Made Flesh is actually not what I thought it was, because I saw it pop up, kind of the algos just kind of shared it to me, and he focuses primarily on how movies are set up, and he kind of talks about like a narrative maybe that you missed, and it almost seems like he's reaching, but then like he actually has the screenplays of some of the writers, and because those things are kind of available, some of those for certain movies, and they admit in like the writings of the movies that what he was saying on the video is actually true. And I was like, oh, cool, like you're totally vindicated here, because some people tell him that he's reaching because the movie is just a lot deeper than you might think. You know, people just usually think they're just entertainment, but there's definitely a lot going on, especially if it's written well. And so he does movies like Castaway, No Country for Old Men, things like that, you know, like really good movies, Ex Machina, and when he breaks it down, he makes you see the structures of things and makes you see these patterns that exist within stories. And he brings it back to the Bible in some of the videos that he's made, because the Bible does the same thing and actually creates patterns within the book. And these patterns are, and I remember Heiser saying it, these patterns are actually more important than those like verse connections, because these patterns are almost setting up like a greater picture to the whole book, and it's kind of giving you almost context, like you say, to know where to look at when you go into the Old Testament, you know, and so I believe John does that quite a bit in the opening verses, you know, when he's talking about in the beginning, and he's really just elevating Jesus to that standard of who he is, and it's really just connecting you to the book of Genesis. You know, like the whole thing is really set up that way to when you read Genesis, almost the first few verses, they're like almost the same, but it's putting injecting Jesus into that moment of creation where he's the one doing the whole thing, and you're just like, whoa, I never really read it. Well, at least a lot of people don't notice it sometimes, that John is telling you that Jesus is the one that was creating, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he was like the one. Like it was just, there was no distinction between the Father and the Son. You know what I mean? And so John is doing the same thing that right here Jesus is doing on the cross, where he's like, I need you to connect these two books. I need you to connect these two instances. I'm him. Like I am the Father. Like I am the Creator. Like this is happening right here. And so he does that a lot throughout that book, and that's one of the reasons I personally also believe that Mark was written for one of the first ones, and it was written for believers, you know. And Matt Miller from Logos Made Flesh kind of set that up, because I believe it's the only book that has the person that shows up at the temple with white garments that isn't an angel, you know. And all the other ones, they're like an angel when they show up in white garments, you know, like and have you read that, John? Sorry, Chris, do you know what I'm talking about?
What was the instance of showing up in the white garments?
So in the other gospels, the people that show up in the white garments are angels, you know. And in the book of Mark, it's not an angel. If you read it, especially in the original language, some of them might say it is, you know, depending on what. But it doesn't. When you look it up in like the Septuagint or whatever, it's the only one that actually says it's a young man, you know. And right.
Presumably Mark himself, is what a lot of people believe in that. But it depends on, I guess, how you understand angel, because it simply just means messenger.
Correct.
And in a sense, Mark himself was one. But
what he was trying to connect,
I think you might be talking about when they're standing at the tomb, right? So right. I was getting confused with the instance, because you mentioned the garment where he runs away naked, where they're with Jesus.
Well,
somebody grabs him by his tunic and it comes off and he runs away naked. But you're talking about at the resurrection, and it says a young man.
Well, that's where I was getting at. Yes, I am. But what I was getting at is when you said
the temple, I was right. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what Matt. If you listen to how he brings it up, he says it it's somewhere in his show, on his YouTube channel, but it's also on our episode. But what he's trying to link up there, and he believes, which is, you know, it's just based on the information and how the story is set up and what Mark is trying to tell you, because he believes that the book was written for believers that have failed to do the job they were supposed to do, you know, and so
that's a common understanding.
Right. And so in doing so, with that context, there's a possibility that young man was the one who was in shame or naked in the prior story. You know what I mean? And then,
yeah. I would love to talk with this guy because I have a completely different idea, which is actually where I can't believe you're even bringing this up, because this is where my dissertation ended up going unintentionally.
Okay.
Because the part that I explained is densely theological, and I wanted that to be my dissertation. And there's a little more even to flesh out that we didn't get to just yet, but because we've kind of moved past it. I hope that Basil and I have an opportunity. Well, we have one. We'll talk about it here soon on our show. It's just, I don't know. We may come back to it, but I'm just going to go with where we're at right now. There's so many different ways to go with this. But yes, most people believe, the reason that they believe, the thing is very interesting about the Gospel of Mark is that in Mark, the oldest manuscripts of Mark don't include the last 12 verses that you're going to have usually in your English Bible, right? So if you go to Mark chapter 16, the last from verse 9 down to 20, those aren't in the oldest manuscripts. And what's really interesting is those are the ones that talk about when Jesus arose and he appeared. And then, the disciples go around and they handle these venomous snakes and they drink poison and they don't die and all of this stuff. And it's like, that's actually nobody believes that that's inspired. Nobody believes that's original to the text. They can see clearly where that got added in. The reason that got added in is because the oldest manuscripts of Mark's gospel end at 16:8. And 16, this is after, Jesus dies right there in 15, and then he's buried, and then the Sabbath, and then the women show up, and I'll just read it. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome bought spices so that they might anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, this is the young man you're talking about, dressed in a white robe, the white robe you're talking about, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Do not be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter." Very important that he mentions that, because most people believe that the Gospel of Mark is actually Peter's testimony of Jesus' life that he told to Mark, his own disciple, who Mark wrote it, but it's Peter's thoughts and Peter's words. Mark just happened to be the one who penned it. That's why it bears Mark's name. But most people believe this is actually Peter's testimony of the Gospel of Mark. But it says, "And Peter, that he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And then in verse 8, it says, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid."
Right.
That's how the Gospel of Mark ends.
Right. That's what we focused on. Like, it sounds kind of like, dude, that sucks.
Yeah. And that's all that they had for a long time. So people start reading it and it's like, what the heck? Like, why do you end your gospel like this? Like, this is no way to end your gospel. And this, the whole, like the whole part that I explained about the cry of dereliction and understanding it in relation to Psalm 22, it was something that I became like obsessed with, and I started doing research. But as I was doing the research, I realized that people had already beaten me to that. Like, I'm not the first person to think of that. But I wanted to write a dissertation on something like this. In order to write a dissertation, you have to be the first person to think of something, because you can't write somebody else's dissertation. So as I'm thinking about it and mulling it over, I get into my Mark seminar, and I have a whole seminar, a whole semester-long class just on the Gospel of Mark. And we come to this issue where, how are we supposed to understand the end of the Gospel of Mark? And what you see here, and this very common idea, like you were just saying, that the gentleman, what's his name from the YouTube channel?
Matt Miller.
What was it?
Matt Miller.
Matt Miller. What he says is pretty widely held by a lot of people, that Mark in his gospel, every time he mentions the disciples are always failing. Like, they're always screwing up. They're never understanding. The disciples are always getting it wrong. And meanwhile, it's these outsiders that are coming in, they're hearing everything, they're understanding everything, and they're the ones who are actually having faith. In his crucifixion narrative, it is the Roman centurion who says, "Surely this man was the Son of God. It's a Roman who acknowledges it, right? While all the Jews are standing around and ridiculing him. And then you have, as one final act at the end, the women who are told to go tell this story run away and they don't tell anybody. Most people believe that what Mark is trying to do is he's trying to say to his audience, these people who are terrified of being persecuted and being crucified, they're not sharing the gospel anymore because they're afraid. They're afraid for their lives. They think, if I go out and share the gospel, if I go out and tell people I'm a Christian, I'm going to get killed. So they don't say anything to anyone because they're afraid. So what Mark is probably trying to do with the end of his gospel is get this response out of his readers by saying these women just got the best news they've ever received, that Jesus is not dead, that he's been risen, and they ran away and they didn't say anything to anybody. So then Mark's readers are going to be like, well, why wouldn't they say anything to anybody? And it's like Mark asking the question right back to them. Exactly. Why wouldn't you say anything? You need to be going out there and you need to be telling this to everybody. Most people believe that already too. The little bit that I added, and this is always what a dissertation does, it just adds one little part to a big long discussion that's already been going on. But most people in their comparisons between Psalm 22 and Mark's crucifixion narrative is they always stop right there at verse 24 where it says that he has not forsaken him. And that's where everybody stops and they think, well, that's the message that Mark was trying to get across. And I said, well, there's still 7 verses left in Psalm 22. And if all those front verses fit in, verses 1 to 24, if those all fit with Mark, then what about these last ones? How do those fit? So I start reading these different ideas about how, we're supposed to understand the ending of Mark. And then I start reading the end of Psalm 22. And what I realized is at the end of the psalm, so in verse 25, after he gets done saying he's not forsaken me, he's not hidden his face from me, he says, from you comes the theme of my praise. In the great assembly, before those who fear you, I will fulfill my vows. The poor will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek the Lord will praise him. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules the nations. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him. Those who cannot keep themselves alive. And just remember Mark's audience reading this for themselves and putting it on themselves. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about what the Lord has done. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. So the psalm concludes with this declaration of the psalmist who has not been forsaken, that because the Lord has not forsaken me, I'm going to tell the whole world what he's done. Mm-hmm. Because he has not abandoned me, I'm going to tell everybody about it. So what I believe, and the thesis of my dissertation and where it ended was, yes, everybody said all this stuff about Jesus not being forsaken. That's very true. However, I think Mark was trying to say even more. When you come to the end of his gospel, he says these people who knew didn't say anything to anybody. They were supposed to. If Mark is drawing his audience back to Psalm 22, they're going to go read Psalm 22. And when they get to the end of Psalm 22, wow, God hasn't forsaken us. Oh, and because of that, we're supposed to tell everybody about what he's done. And there's this reminder that's embedded right there into the end. So yes, paints the disciples as failures is what most people believe. I don't necessarily think that that's what Mark is trying to do. I don't think he's trying to say you guys are worthless. But what he's trying to do is he's saying failure has happened over and over and over again, but it's never so much that the Lord will forsake you. It's never so much that he will turn away from you. He's done so much for you. You need to tell the world in a nutshell.
Well, yeah, his end result, the journey is a little different where you guys and him are, but the end result is pretty similar. He wasn't highlighting that it was failure. He was highlighting that failure happened, and regardless of that, God worked in them and they ended up succeeding because that was part of the plan. You know what I mean? And really the story he was trying to really bolster up, it was more that it's not a story of failure, it's a story of redemption. And so these people, yes, they're failing, but then when you read the other gospels and the other stories, and like when you say you're cross-referencing Psalms 22, you see that they did accomplish what they were supposed to do, but not at the end of this book, but they did do it, And so this whole thing is not a highlight of failure, but it's a highlight of like, dude, they ended up doing it. God still did what he he needed to do, even when it ended like that. So it's not like, hey man, you know what I mean? So,
and that is even the natural inference to be drawn to, that a lot of people have seen in the end, that Mark says the women said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Well, then you're sitting there hearing the story and you're like, well, they must have told somebody, because we're hearing it right now.
Exactly.
And then Mark is not saying that was the final result, but he's saying there was a moment in time these women were so afraid they didn't say anything. But guess what? They did eventually say something to someone, because you guys are now hearing the story. So you guys need to go say something to someone too. But yeah, all of that is packaged up like in the end of it. And this is, it's another one of those things. If you read the end of Mark just at a surface, if you read that last verse just at a surface level, you don't do any more thinking, but you just say, well, what does the Bible say? Well, the Bible says these women went to the tomb and they didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. So we know the women didn't say anything. It's like, well, there's obviously something else going on there. And this is where all of these different types of interpretation come in, and how should we understand this and what's actually going on. So it's amazing that you have been on this same kind of journey here lately.
Well, wow. God knows what he's doing, I guess, exactly what's happening. Indeed. So Basil, any thoughts, concerns, what's going on?
No, I just like it when Chris flexes like that. Makes me just really
was that a flex? Was I flexing?
I saw those veins popping out.
Oh man,
you got a pump on. You're looking good, man. Now, see, and that's the kind of fun stuff you can expect when tuning into Ravel.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned that you have a series coming up. Was that off air? Am I giving away a secret?
No, are you talking to me?
Yeah.
No, this episode is part of a series.
Oh, part of a series.
Yeah.
Yes.
So when we say series, we name them the same thing. It was like, this one's it's going to be Biblical Context Volume 4, I believe. But we'll do that, and since it's related to a subject we talk about, we just want people to reference that there's other ones related to this one.
Totally.
And so,
I love that.
Yeah.
Especially because Chris and I. Well, Chris, can I give away the secret sauce? I mean, we got people.
I think he actually said this wasn't going to air for like a month, so I think we're good. I think.
Well, yeah,
because I still have like 4 or 5 episodes in the can, and then this one.
We're time traveling right now.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, I love that. So. We have a series coming up, which should be out. There should be quite a few episodes of it out by the time this airs. And we're doing a series on the concept of the death of God, which is we're very excited for. We've got lots of good guests. We've got lots of good content, even just between Chris and I, and it does relate a little bit to what we've been talking about here, as well as Chris's dissertation. So we've got a whole lineup of episodes on the death of God, which I'm excited for, because even hearing those words, Christians, American Christians, will have a very specific set of triggers and reactions based on that phrase alone. In fact, we've had the Hollywood movies God's Not Dead with Kevin Sorbo,
right,
and other great American talent.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think there's a second one coming out, isn't
it's
there?
part
God's
4
still
now.
Not Dead? Is that what they're calling it?
No, there's 4 now.
It's not. They're not up to 4, are they?
Yeah, God's Not Dead 2 is old news, bro.
So
oh my goodness! That shows
Chris,
how much I pay attention.
Yeah, man.
I don't know.
There's at least 2 for sure.
The other ones came out. When did these come out? I don't know.
Yeah,
I only saw the first one. I started getting all these texts from people, and it was like, God's Not Dead. I was just getting a bunch of texts like randomly throughout the week, and I was like, what the heck is this? And then I went and saw the movie, and I was like,
all these Christians are suddenly very into Nietzsche. There's a Nietzschean revival going on in the church.
There's 4 of those?
There's 2.
Anyway,
there's 2. No, I'm looking at it right now. There's 2, and there's a 3rd one coming. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. So along with catching God's Not Dead 2 or 3, you can tune into Ravel, God's Not, or Death of God series, where we talk to a philosopher, we talk to theologians, we talk to Chris, we talk amongst ourselves, and really explore the term, the death of God, what that means, what it meant in the context of Nietzsche, which is a lot different than how the sort of mainstream church has explained it.
Yeah.
He's not saying it's better that way, but you can gain a much better understanding of what Nietzsche was actually talking about when he said, God is dead and you killed him.
I think that's very helpful, actually, because...
So I'm very excited about that. I wanted to plug that real quick. So, if people are looking for, we kind of recommend starting at the beginning of Ravel, because we do, not that you can't just tune in on any episode, but we do, we tried hard. We put a lot of work into it, guys, to kind of build the culture basis, the foundation of who we are and how to think about what we are doing on the show. So you can start at the Prolegomena, which is kind of the first one.
Mm-hmm.
There's also Hello World too, but you can skip that if you want. You can start with Prolegomena. I recommend everybody do it, because it was, going back to the ideas that I had been coming in contact with and really wanting to sort of parse out in a safe space, this conversation about the death of God, which is really a central aspect to Christian theology over the centuries. But the triggering in the modern American church is so strong that I feel that the Christian church is missing out a little bit by not exploring the concept in all of its different angles. And, Chris's dissertation had a lot to do with it too. So we get to, again, see Chris flex all over the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm going to put some oil on my arms. I didn't realize even that was going on. I didn't know anybody was seeing, but I'm going to.
Yeah, man.
Don't use the Johnson & Johnson baby oil. That's getting recalled. You got to find a nice mineral oil or something. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know anything about bodybuilding.
I gotta say too, though, that came up so naturally too, because Basil, as you and I were talking, I think you somehow brought it up and you said, I've been thinking a lot about this, kind of how you just said, the death of God. And I was like, that's basically my dissertation. So let's do it. And then we got Rollins on and a couple other guests. So yeah, it's going to be, I guess, our first attempt at a series. So I'm excited about it too.
I'm excited. It sounds exciting because I don't know if you guys are ever going to speak more on Nietzsche or philosophers like that, because that stuff is growing quite a bit, and I think primarily because Jordan Peterson brings him up a lot. That psychologist, and he's gotten really popular in the Christian community. So, these thinkers are. That's kind of a cool thing. They're having their debates and things like that. And I have some of his books; they're interesting. But I could see some of the things he quotes the Bible a lot in his first book called 12 Rules for Life or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, it's pretty interesting, but also because he approaches it from that Nietzsche philosophical perspective, sometimes comes with different interpretations, and it's pretty dangerous for believers as well. So I think one of the reasons people like the book, one of the reasons Christians jumped on it a lot is because it does mention a lot of things that a lot of he brings to light archetypes that people don't see. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I was going to say, my first exposure to Jordan Peterson, he did a lecture series through Genesis.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was listening to him, and I thought he was a believer.
Right.
And I was like 3 or 4 hours, I think, into this lecture series, just hearing everything he was saying. I think I might have been in my PhD program, had a pretty good foundation, for understanding the Bible, was listening to all this. I was like, yeah, this is really good. Yeah, this is consistent with the things I've been learning. And then somewhere like 4 hours in or something, the 4th episode or however he broke them up, he was like, and obviously none of this stuff is true because these are just stories that were told to explain. And I was like, what?
Mm-hmm.
And that was like the first moment that I was like, this guy's not a believer.
Yeah.
But I think actually I had heard that he may be a Christian now. I'm not entirely sure. You guys might know if you keep up with that kind of stuff.
I've been seeing a lot of through his episode, because his wife was some sort of Christian, and I don't know, I hear like a lot of things where he's like, I think he's close, I think he's coming, amongst the Christian community, he's close to receiving the Lord and things like that. But I've never seen the that yet. I don't know. I kind of lost interest, to be honest. I was like, no, I think I'm done with this. I read the first 2 books that he released recently, and I'm just kind of over it now. But anyway,
he definitely knows the Bible.
He knows a lot about symbols and archetypes, which actually help really interpret a lot of things in the Bible. And then he'll say things like that, you know.
That's a really fascinating conversation too. I would love to. We're at 2 hours already, but that's one we'll have to do that on the show, Basil. But I'd love to come back here and talk about it here too. When you started talking about Miller getting into that, there are so many. Typology generally is how people refer to it in the Bible, but you see that all the way through where you have these different types, these characters who are kind of, portraying, even prophetically in their lives, future events that are going to happen. It's probably really like one of my favorite areas to really start looking at, and it gets a little in academia. People kind of,
I think
they don't take it too seriously. Sometimes they're like, you can't. We don't know that that's what that meant. And I was like, it seems pretty clear to me. So
I think you'll love his videos. It's one of those
things, but I really love it. I love to talk about it.
Yeah, you'll love his videos then. But it's all about movies, but they're very short and sweet, like 10, 15 minutes, and he just dives in, and they're really, really good explanations. And like I said, he's pretty spot on. Once he gets a hold of the actual stories, he realizes he was like actually right, not just making it up. And he sometimes will have to post that because people think like you're just stretching, you're just making stuff up, but no, he's got some good insights on archetypes.
Does he talk about, Baz, you might even know about this, somebody said one time that there's only like 3 stories that have ever been told. There's like these 3 different narratives or something, and you can basically take any story and find how every story fits kind of loosely, into this, or broadly, however you want to say it, into this particular setup. And there's only 3 of them. And I had a friend of mine I worked with one time who was a huge movie buff. Sounds like he'd like this guy too, but he was like, Harry Potter is basically the same movie as Star Wars. And I was like, what are you talking about, man? And then he starts explaining it to me, and I was like, oh my goodness, Harry Potter is the same as Star Wars.
Yeah, because there's the hero archetypes, the father-son archetypes, and things like that.
The hero archetype who ends up not ending up with the girl, but then there's like the weird sidekick guy who actually ends up getting the girl, but then there's like this. He even went on to say like Chewbacca, and then I haven't seen the Harry Potters. I don't know, but there's apparently a big hairy dude in Harry Potter who's kind of like, he said he was Chewbacca. I don't know. He did a lot better justice. People are hearing me say it like, well, that's rubbish, but it's there. You can look it up online, Google it or something.
We'll do. So, hey, Baz, any final thoughts? Any final things that you want to, like, as you like to say, get off your chest before we land this plane?
He's got you down, man.
Yeah,
I know. He's done his research. Let me think here. Was there anything? No, I already plugged the show as much as I possibly can. That's a good one.
Right.
You got other shows to plug? I'm sure probably.
Oh, I could plug all sorts of shows, but I try to keep it down to a minimum. But no, this was wonderful. I'm stoked to get a chance to come on the show with Chris, because again, I just feel so blessed to have teamed up with Chris, because as you can see, all you got to do is put a quarter in the guy, and he will give you
get your money's worth.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's, and it's even better on the show. So make sure to check out Ravel. Again, it's a whole thing. There's 2 Ravels. We're the one with the white background and the cool logo. But I'd really appreciate it if everybody checked it out. And again, you'll hear the disclaimer. We had to put a disclaimer at the beginning of the show, because we really don't pull any punches, and we really do. We make a point to not get scared by any ideas, and mainly because we think that that's kind of one of the problems keeping people in sort of a stagnant, I would say individuals in perhaps a stagnant condition, but also the church. Mainly the American Christian church specifically, is this idea that ideas are too dangerous to even come in contact with. And as I say on whatever show I'm on at the time, is that Christians really were sort of the first cancel culture perpetrators. And so it's funny to see, Christians get mad at cancel culture because Christians have been canceling people they don't like for forever. and it's all based and it's all based on this idea that there are ideas that are too dangerous to even let into your ears and to even think about. And we're very passionate about, does an idea stand up to scrutiny? If it doesn't, then great, no harm. And if it does, then it's something that we should be thinking about. And, we explore the Bible and theology from all different angles. Some, I would say maybe most angles are triggering to somebody.
Oh, yeah.
So, we had to put a disclaimer at the beginning of the show, but we think that the more you're able to come in contact with ideas that you don't agree with, and it's not even about agree, but maybe you've never heard about before, maybe you've been taught to stay away from ideas that don't come from an approved source or things like that. This will be just a small little rebellion to go listen to Ravel. You'll come in contact with dangerous ideas and decide for yourself what you think about them. Chris can tell you, I was worried about some of the guests that we had on and some of the ideas that we are presenting, or not even presenting, but wrestling with on the show. But so far so good. As long as you come at the show with a good head on your shoulders and a desire to grow, that's what's going to happen. So check us out.
Indeed, Chris. Any final thoughts or anything you want to say?
No, man. I really appreciate the opportunity. This is this was my first invitation to do another show. So
to cross universes.
What's that?
It said this is your first cross universe experience.
Yeah, my first. Yeah. So I had appeared on Basil's, but that was more me asking to come on. He put out the invitation.
Right.
I responded. This was we were happy to get the ask, and I know Basil. As I was talking to him, I said, "What do you think about these fire theft guys?" He said, "No, yeah, they're great. We should definitely make that happen." So
that's good. Thanks for that,
I just want to say thanks.
I'm always self-conscious.
Man.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, me too. Oh gosh, yeah, I don't think that ever stops. Yeah.
Just give it some time, guys. You'll stop even being aware of your own mouth as you speak nonsense into the internet.
Yeah.
I do actually want to put it out there that like Chris was alluding to, we are open to anybody out there who wants to talk to us about the show or about anything. Not to use your show as a call for other shows to have us on, but I'm just saying the doors are open, folks. Yeah, and you can get in contact with us at contact@ravelpodcast.com. We do a lot of question and answer episodes because that's part of the goal too, is to connect with the real questions out in the world. So we actually just dropped, we don't call them Q&A episodes, we call them asked and not answered, because we're not here to set any definitive answers to any questions, but we do take a good amount of time. We really like to give the questions as much attention as they deserve. And Chris will full on do research on people's questions. So you will not find a more fruitful Q&A episode than Ravel's Q&A, asked and not answered. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at contact@ravelpodcast.com. And we are always open to go on any shows and talk about whatever. So, if you got any other podcast producers out there looking for guests, our doors are open. You can also head over to ravelpodcast.com where you'll find links to all of our stuff. So go check it out. We think everybody will like it very much. And according to us, it's what the world needs right now.
It's what the world needs.
I would agree. Well, folks, if you didn't catch those links, as always, they'll send me the links and they'll be available for you guys in the show notes. So don't worry about that. Definitely don't want this to be the first time or only time, I would say. I want you guys back for sure. There's some things I'd like to really dive into. I've bothered Mike Davis because he's got a lot of he's a doctorate and all this other stuff as well. But I mean, he lives so close to me. He helps me with like my family. Guess what, Basil?
What?
Mike Davis is gonna marry me, bro.
Yeah, buddy.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I talked to that guy. Maybe I'll have to sneak.
We'll be looking for our invitations in the
I'll have the wedding crash.
Oh, dude, you guys are so invited. I mean, but like, what was I gonna say? No, so I was saying, I hate to bother him all the time, but I would want to definitely tackle other things based on what I see out there. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the show, there's some weird things out there when you start getting into the fringe and they start telling you, like, specifically, I want to get into why we should trust Paul's writings. You know what I mean? Because that's a huge one that's growing in the fringe community, is that Paul...
I think we actually have a question in our inbox about that right now, actually.
Okay. Yeah, and I see that a lot. I've seen it that he's just like a wolf in sheep's clothing, and that there's like this whole thing. And so I'm like, all right, well, let's get into that, and Mike said he was going to do it, but he's also pretty busy, so I haven't been able to get it done, so maybe something like that in the future. If we can do that, you guys are more than welcome to come back on the show. You know what I'm saying?
That's great. Thanks a lot, man. Appreciate it. And thanks to your listeners for sitting through.
Yes, indeed. Well, all right, guys, stick with me. And as always, these folks are going to listen to some sweet tunes. Here we go.